Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for braving the weather today. I know that definitely has impacted based on how many people registered, right? You can't control the weather. Yes? No. Oh, sorry. Oh, great. So today we're here to have a discussion about the legacy and influence of the artist Kazuo Nakamura. And this is a program that complements the exhibition that's installed behind us called Universal Pattern, and that exhibition is up until March 5th. And just before we begin, I realized I should mention that we are going to be filming this, so if there is anybody that didn't make it out because of the weather, that there'll be an opportunity to view it on our YouTube channel. So that's something that will hopefully get more people to see this talk. So I'm going to start with acknowledging the land that we're on. So the Robert McLaughlin Gallery is in the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation. This land has been the traditional territory of the Mishii-Sagig Nishnabeg since 1700. Before that time, it was stewarded by various communities belonging to the Haudenosaunee, Wendat, and Wendat confederacies. It's covered under the Williams Treaties and the Dish with One Spoon Wampum. This area continues to be home to many Indigenous people from across Mishiki-Minisee. We recognize the sovereignty of all Indigenous nations and are grateful for the opportunity to learn, live, and work on this land. We acknowledge that the RMG is in treaty land and respect our collective responsibility to protect and nurture the land. We also recognize the continuing impacts of colonialism and our responsibilities to redress the ways this has helped shape our institution or organization. We're committed to working to address structural inequities and to centering Indigenous voices in the gallery. So my name's Sonia Jones, and I'm the Curator of Collections at the Robert McLaughlin Gallery, and it's my absolute pleasure to introduce the three panelists today. So we have Louise Noguchi, who's an artist and a professor in the Art and Art History program at the University of Toronto, Mississauga and Sheridan College. Her work has been included in solo and group exhibitions across Canada and internationally, including the Ducci Museum in Munich, Oakville Galleries, the Canadian Museum of Contemporary Photography, the Canadian Embassy in Tokyo, Japan, and the Power Plant in Toronto. And then next we have Dr. John Hatch, who is Associate Professor of Art History at Western University in London, Ontario. He received his doctorate from the University of Essex in Art History and Theory. His area of research is 20th century European and American art and theory, with a particular interest in the points of convergence between art and science. He is the Art Canada Institute author of monographs on Patterson-Ewing and most recently Kazuo Nakamura. He is currently working on the third title examining the life and work of Doris McCarthy. And then we're joined by Bryce Kanbara, who has been working for nearly 5 decades across media in painting, printmaking, and sculpture, and as a curator and arts administrator. He was a founding member and the first administrator of Hamilton's Artists, Inc. in the late 1970s and early 1980s. He went on to hold curatorial positions at the Burlington Art Center, Art Gallery of Hamilton, the Glenhurst Art Gallery in Brantford, the JC Gallery at the Japanese Canadian Cultural Center in Toronto. He was also executive director of the Toronto chapter of the National Association of Japanese Canadians. He is the proprietor of Yumi Gallery and has been since 2003. And in 2021, he won a Governor General's Award in Visual and Media Arts for his countless contributions. So we're going to start off this talk by having each of the panelists give an opening statement. And then it will be followed by a discussion and then questions from the audience at the end, and then there'll be time for some refreshments and mingling where all of us will be available to answer any further questions. So we're going to start off with Louise.
Okay. I had to write this down, so forgive me. John G. Hatch and Bryce Kanbara are far more knowledgeable about Kazuo Nakamura and his artworks, so I thought I would just speak about my own perspectives on Kazuo, or Kaz as he was often known as. I heard about Kazuo Nakamura long before I ever saw his paintings. He was known amongst the Japanese community as a successful artist. In Toronto, there were other Japanese Canadian artists at the time, including Ruth Yamada, Kazuo Hamasaki, and Shizuo Takashima, to name a few. But no one had the recognition that Kaz did. His work was reviewed in the local and national media with images of himself and his work often alongside fellow members of Painters 11. He was not bound to painting in a traditional Japanese manner, nor did he limit his exhibitions to the Japanese arts community. I would imagine his success gave the Japanese community a sense that opportunities were opening up for them. You must remember that when Kaz was becoming known in the 1950s and 60s, Japanese Canadians were still living with the stigma of Pearl Harbor and their wrongful internment within the interior of British Columbia. This after effect lasted for many years. To give you a personal example, I remember when I was in grade 2, which would have been around 1965, I was still being taunted by kids shouting, "The Japs lost the war, the Japs lost the war." I don't know where this came from. The movies, television, public sentiment, this and other incidents made me wonder if I would ever be free from being identified by this history. So I imagined for my parents and my grandparents who had been interned during the war, seeing Kaz receive notice for his art and not for being Japanese or being Japanese Canadian would have brought hope for the future, a hope of not being defined or limited by their race. Obviously, one can never be free of ignorance in the way others perceive you, but the recognition of Kaz's work by the wider community would have been a small but important sign of change. I must acknowledge Kaz's influence on my life. No doubt my parents' acceptance of my desire to become an artist and attend the Ontario College of Art was eased by Kaz's success. So when I attended art school in the late 1970s, it was a post-Painters 11 world. I was never shown work by Kazuo Nakamura, but then again, few painting instructors would show us examples of other artists' work. You have to remember back in the 1970s, there was no internet or PowerPoint, so if you wanted to show pictures of artists' work, you would either have to take slides of it or go to the library, and possibly they might have photographs by different artists. So instead you were to show them, your teachers, your work, and they would make comments. And sometimes they would give you names of artists to look up. The faculty were also into saying things reminiscent of the 1960s hippie era, such as consult the I Ching or paint with anything but a brush. American color field painting was held up as the ultimate example of painting, which made Jack Bush's work very popular amongst students, while a few showed interest in Harold Town's work. William Ronald, a founding member of Painters 11, was also talked about, but only in the context of his controversial city TV show, Free for All. I don't know if some of you remember that show, but anyhow, I remember. Never did I hear Kazuo Nakamura's name come up in a conversation. In retrospect, the flamboyant nature of some members of Painters 11 might have caught more attention from the public with their freer lifestyles and their art for art's sake approach to painting that favored experimentation and non-objective approaches to art making. Freedom from boundaries and restrictions in making art were the dictum of art schools in the late 1970s. However, I sense that while Nakamura's work was often abstract and non-representational, he was very aware of the boundaries and structures in life. As a Japanese Canadian growing up in British Columbia, he would have faced restrictions such as not being allowed to return to the West Coast until 1949, 4 years after the war, not allowed to vote until 1948, prohibition of becoming a doctor, pharmacist, or going into law. There were also curfew restrictions, travel restrictions, confiscation of property, enforced lower wages, etc. Perhaps it was too unrealistic for Nakamura to have such notions as art for art's sake. While Kaz's work is often known for its abstract imagery, for me there is much intention behind whatever he did. His work was rigorously focused on the structures and boundaries within space and perception. Whenever I see his paintings, there is an urgency to articulate meaning to the viewer, which sometimes could be in the form of an inner world, an acknowledgement of physical and psychological structures, and the use of numbers to convey universal codes. When I first met Kaz as a young artist, I was amazed to hear him say that he followed my work over the past few years. He was up to date with what was happening in art, something that surprised me as a naive, young, immature artist, which I now recognize now that I am a senior artist. Well, more mature artist, I guess. And in retrospect, I suppose Kaz did not see many young Japanese artists working in Toronto and was trying to support and encourage me. His support, along with other senior artists such as Aiko Suzuki, Nobuo Kubota, and Joyce Whelan, gave me validation to keep on going as an artist. An example of Kaz's support was relaying advice that painter Goodrich Roberts once told him. He said, "Roberts told me that there were many better painters than himself, but no one remembers them or knows their work because they quit painting." Roberts' advice to Kaz was to keep making art and never stop. This was also Kaz's advice to me, but what I really sensed was Kaz was trying to say that making art is a very serious endeavor and a lifetime of work for an artist. At one of these meetings with Kaz, I posed some questions which I had been asked in the past and wondered if he had ever been asked the same questions, such as, "Your work looks so Asian influenced." And sometimes I was asked the opposite to this question. "Why do you make contemporary artwork? Why doesn't your work reflect your Asian heritage?" Kaz said, "Just follow your own direction and create work that you want to pursue," which is what I assume Kaz also did. No matter how much people have said his work feels very Zen or Japanese, for me, Kaz's work reflects Kaz, serious, impactful, and unwavering. I have a few other anecdotes to give you an idea about Kazuo Nakamura. I remember a humorous incident at the 1994 I-Symposium of Japanese Canadians in the Arts, which really underscored his commitment to art. At the symposium, we were put into groups. Kaz was not in my group, but an artist in his group was surprised by Kaz's response to art grants. She told us that Kaz said, "In our day, there was no such thing as the Canada Council or the Ontario Arts Council." She then asked them, "Then what did you do?" "Starve," was Kaz's response. We all thought this was an old-fashioned way to think about being an artist, but as I think more about it, his response exemplifies the dedication and determination to have an art practice in his day. I wonder where artists would be today without the luxuries of grants, residencies, arts awards, professorships, and international exhibitions. How many artists would still have a dedicated career as Kaz once did? Another anecdote comes from my 95-year-old uncle. This is part of my research here. George Nakamura, who has no relationship to Kaz, but his plastic company would embed Gerald Gladstone's sculptures in acrylic. My uncle said that Kaz was not into chit-chat, and that he only spoke on weighty topics. He doesn't remember any particular conversation, but said they were always very meaningful. Even the way Kaz would say hello had a lot of meaning to it. This intensity is what I see in Kaz's work, and it is also why whenever I see a Kazuo Nakamura painting, it draws me in, just as Kaz the person always would. In the end, I cannot separate Kazuo Nakamura from his artwork. They are two of the same.
No, that was Wonderful. Thank you so much. And John, I believe you have an opening statement and some slides to go with it.
A few slides, right? Thanks for the introduction, by the way. Every time I hear an introduction of my work, I always wonder, why am I changing the litter of my family cats? You know, with that sort of reputation. But anyway, as an historian, I'm interested in terms of, I give you more of the sort of visual side of Nakamura's work, and I'm interested in terms of the influences, and as the title of today's presentation is the legacy as well. And one of the things that fascinated me with Nakamura, and we'll have the next slide, is just the phenomenal range of work and the development of his work in such a short period of time. So we're looking at a piece from 1949, and then the next slide, these will go pretty quickly. This is one from around 1950 called Autumn, and then the next slide, we're looking at trees, which I think is in the collection behind you. So, I mean, we're talking from 49 to 51, and then the next slide is a landscape from 52, and then we see the next slide for us. Both of those works are also in this exhibition, and then the next slide. Interview, whoa, that was Interview, which is only 5 years separated from the Don Valley image, and then the next one is, completely abstract in terms of into space, where he's using his string in this work. And then the next one, which is 56, 2 years after the 54 one, which is not in this collection, but there are two examples of it in the background of Prairie Towers. And then finally, the string works from the 1956-57, which you find here. So, I mean, this is just in a span of 8 years, and a very rich variety of work as well. It's just, he's experimented with a lot of stuff. And a lot of artists of his generation tended, once they found their style, to stick with that style. That's what they became identified with. But with Kaz, that wasn't the case. He just constantly experimented with his work. And I haven't even touched on the next slide, which is his sculpture. This one out of plaster, and then the next one, wire piece, which I think Chris Cutts had one that he was trying to reassemble at one point of Kaz's. This is from about the 1950s. And then the next one, which is unfortunately in storage at Pearson Airport, I found out, but it was hanging at Pearson Airport for the longest time, of Galaxies, which is two sculptures there. And then I haven't even touched the most popular style, which is the next work, which is the landscape style that he became famous for, and that he constantly reproduced throughout his career, because they were easy money makers in a sense for him, but the people kept asking for them and calling for them. And then we haven't even touched on the geometric work, which this one hung in his living room for the longest period of time, and then going on to even simpler pieces from this one's 65, which he painted these until the early 70s, and then the number series, which he ended his career with, which he did not exhibit all that much in terms of publicly, right, Chris, in terms of large exhibitions. These were really private works for him that he produced. And so, I mean, it's a phenomenal range, and like I said, you rarely see an artist have this range of work and this level of experimentation, but some of the credit goes with the next slide, which is the Painter's 11. I think, he arrived in Toronto at a fortunate time where he had an older generation that was giving way to a much younger, much more experimental generation, and the Painter's 11 were that generation. I think even though in interviews that he had with John Murray, that he sort of said, well, I wasn't really influenced by any of the Painter's 11, which stylistically he wasn't. But certainly they gave him permission and the freedom to really experiment with the work, and that was one of the things, the valuable things that I think he got from Painter's 11, was this sort of freedom to just try things out. And so next slide is a nice picture of Kaz sitting on the stool there with the rest of the Painter's 11. And then his work was markedly different, and I think Louise pointed this out as well, if we can see the next slide, which is, a Herald Town work. They tend to be, most of the Painter's 11 tend to be very large gestural pieces. I have another one next, should be a Ray Mead, which is also in the collection here as well. I've tried to stick with the ones that are here. Large gestural works, whereas Kaz's work was much more subdued. And what's interesting is, for me, he embodied both the older generation and a newer generation, and did so in a way that he was still extremely inventive, but he was looking at much bigger questions, and questions related to humanity, and I think in part it was the internment experience which really bowled over his world and wondered, okay, what's happening here, and how do I how do I address this? And you can see the difference in the next slide, because I have Kazuo Nakamura's Hemlocks, which I think Jane still has, from 1957. And here's a Joan Mitchell abstract expressionist work, American artist, who did have some connections with the Canadians. She was partnered with Jean-Paul Riopel for a short time. But this is her version of a hemlock. And his is much more controlled. There's a great element of this sort of beautiful brushwork that he's imposed on it, and yet created still a sort of field work, an almost abstract landscape. Whereas the Hemlock by Joan Mitchell, very beautiful work for different reasons, but much more gestural and not really necessarily interested in the bigger questions of, what's the order and structure of our universe, which is going to be the sort of larger question that Kaz is going to really be interested in terms of some of the scientific work. And then, if just to compare with some of the other painters, 11, the next slide, here's Summer Brilliance, which, do you still have this one, Chris? Yeah. Which is a beautiful work, but most of Kaz's work were relatively small size, as you can see. I mean, he didn't go for the huge works, but just to give you a comparison with some of the painters, 11, next slide, I've sort of fixed it in terms of the ratio and the scale of them, just to give you a sense of him being much more quiet, much more lyrical, and much more, I think, intimate in what he wanted to get across, as opposed to the larger gestural works. Next slide is a Harold Town work, just to give you, again, the scale of these. And then just to go back to the brilliance, I mean, this is, going into a pure abstraction as well, but not necessarily a gestural abstraction. And again, his inquiry is going to be more in terms of questioning this element of humanity, its direction, and doing it, like I said, on a much more intimate and personal style. The other thing, next slide, is just the radicalness of the work. I mean, as much as he may have been sort of old school and sort of being a modernist in some of his ideas, it's amazing that the work that he's producing is very much in sort of more of a postmodern vein. And so the string works obviously are quite fascinating in that particular case. And the only thing that anticipates it, that comes earlier internationally, is the next slide, Robert Rauschenberg's white painting, which is one of the earliest pure monochromatic works that you have. There's a couple of Russian examples from slightly earlier, but Rauschenberg's white and white paintings are pure monochrome from 51. But then Kaz is anticipating some of the more radical gestures afterwards. Next slide. Yves Klein and his famous blue monochrome canvases are coming after Kaz's own sort of abstract monochromatic works. The next one. And I'm showing this because this is Yves Klein's famous leap into the void. Kaz never went in that direction. It's interesting that he was quite a radical, and radical in a good way. He was very much experimental in a sense, but always stayed within painting and within sculpture. So he remained within the traditional framework, but he still pushed that framework as far as you could go, whereas people like Yves Klein obviously went and jumped in space, or our next artist, which, again, Kaz is anticipating this type of monochromatic canvas by the Italian Piero Manzoni, and it's odd because the next slide, I'm always tempted because I see this beautiful, the Two Horizons, which is here as well, and that use of the line. Piero Manzoni is famous for his line works, which is the next slide. And they have a nice one at the Herning gallery there. Always reminds me of Kaz's work on left. But Manzoni then created huge line works that went on for meters and meters. And obviously Kaz didn't go in the direction that Manzoni went next, which is canning his own poo, which Manzoni was famous for, and doing multiples of that. Even in the Canadian context, he anticipates Agnes Denis' works as well in the 1960s, and a lot of the minimalist pieces. So, I mean, it's amazing how forward-thinking he was, and I think the Painters 11 gave him that freedom to really sort of experiment, even though he didn't necessarily have the same sensibility as they had in terms of his work. And the other thing I want to highlight is the sort of traditional side is Kaz always seems to have had his eye open to looking at different art movements, art influences. Next slide. Sorry, and we can skip. This one, by the way, I should, the previous one, sorry about that, is the one that's in the Museum of Modern Art. So Alfred Barr, who was the director of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, went out of his way to purchase this work of Kaz, and it's still at the MoMA. He also had made a couple of other purchases of Kaz's work for private collectors in New York as well. So he was certainly gaining international attention. Back to the next slide. So, I mean, for example, the Green Landscape, 1966, influenced by the Poppies by Monet, and in fact, amongst his papers is a reproduction of this work when he passed away, of the Monet. Next slide. Paul Cézanne was one that he was very much influenced by, and there is a sort of basic coloration and look of these two works that's very similar, and he was quite fascinated by the post-impressionists like Cézanne. Next. Pete Mondrian is another important one, and this is an influence that he would have encountered at the Central Technical School in Toronto, which is where he got his art education, and there's a wonderful link between that. And I'm not just showing this to say that Kaz is not original. The beauty of it is that he takes that work and pushes it even further. I mean, he is definitely putting his own very individual stamp, but I think he understands that for an artist to be successful, they have to understand the sort of universal movement of what art is doing generally as opposed to just locally in a sense. And I think that's why he really was interested in looking at a lot of art movements and seeing what he could potentially draw from them. Because he's never just a simple copyist of the work. He sort of takes the lessons that he sees and absorbs them and make them very much of his own. Next. So this one's more tenuous. Some people have pointed out that there's a connection between the metaphysical painting of the Italian artist Chirico and his treatment of space with Kaz's own examples in terms of works like Suspension, which is back there. Next work. So the inner structure works, the slightly blurred appearance that you see, and there's a wonderful example here, is partly tied into an interest with Monet's use of sort of the hazy lighting in the Monet. Next one, and it's something that he's also drawing from because fog images are quite popular in terms of Japanese imagery as well. Next slide. And then the coloration is something that Kaz, it was the only thing that I've read that he acknowledged there was a sort of Japanese influence, because like you pointed out, a lot of people ask, well, what's Japanese about your work? And the only thing he admitted to was maybe the monotone color of it was the only thing, which is probably the bluish green, which is all over his work, is the only thing that comes out in terms of the use of the Azuri prints, Japanese Azuri prints. Next slide. And then obviously if you saw the In Space in the collection here, that was influenced by Van Gogh's irises. It was the first art book he purchased when he moved to Hamilton before coming to Toronto, was a book on Van Gogh. And then the next slide, how am I doing on time, by the way? Okay. The other element with Kaz and what makes his work quite unique was his interest in science, which is where I sort of came in. And so you see on the right a solar spectrum, which astronomers use to identify the composition, well, obviously of the sun, but of distant planets. And this is something that comes to be incorporated in some of Kaz's work almost literally, although it's also tied into some of the photo strips that are used to make sure that you've got the true color. Next slide. And there is this famous image of him reading Scientific American, 1957, quite proudly holding up that issue. And Scientific American was a very important and continues even today, but then was a huge magazine conveying some popular concepts or new ideas that were emerging, not cheapening them that much. I mean, it was making it more accessible, but still presenting some complex ideas. And that opened up a whole range of things. The next slide is, the connection of some of the coloration of that you have in terms of what's called their Cherenkov effect in nuclear power plants, which is when you take the rods out or into the water, you have this coloration that occurs of it that's close to the coloration of this work. That one might be a bit of a stretch, but the line works are definitely indebted to the next slide, images of subatomic particles. Which this is actually coming out of 1957 Scientific American, and if we look at the next work, that's where these works are coming out of in terms of their influence. They're paralleling exactly that sort of moment of him observing or seeing some of the images of all we're getting is not the subatomic particles, but rather the traces of those subatomic particles, which he's looking at there. And so the next work, and that's similarly in terms of the case of with Untitled Strings. But the next piece that I'm going to end with is the tower structures, which unfortunately is lost. It's reproduced in a few locations, and there is a catalog entry at Concordia University for the tower structures. But this has a nice connection in terms of looking at tradition. The next slide being inspired partly by Japanese temples in terms of the construction, but also having a connection to the next slide, subatomic or nuclear physics. And this was the first, the famous Chicago Pile 1, where they had the first chain reaction, controlled chain reaction, which then allowed for the development of the atomic bomb. And that is something that obviously had quite, next slide, quite a profound impact on Kaz. And this was amongst his papers when he passed away, which was the 50-year, not celebration, but marking the 50th year of the bombing of Hiroshima, which, is where the Nakamuras were originally from. So when they had the option of moving out east, the other option was to go back to Japan, to where they came from, and that obviously was not going to be a possibility. And all of that simply doesn't even touch what Louise touched on the next slide, which was the internment of the family in Tashmi in BC, and that certainly had a huge impact on Kaz's work. And it's odd that and the idea of the physics or the nuclear physics would come sort of oddly together, but I think he was interested in sort of bringing humanity together. There are a number of sketches of his tracing the history and the development of society from the Greeks, the Egyptians, Chinese, the Japanese, but looking towards a greater universalism and a coming together of all of those cultures rather than a coming apart, but which would be marked by the one time where they came apart quite severely in terms of the internment at that time. So that's what I have to say in terms of just, like I said, the range of the work is just phenomenal, and some of the subjects that he deals with are dealing with really big questions. And like I said, the nice thing about it is that it's presented in a language that's accessible to a great extent for people like myself and like anyone in this audience. So thank you.
Wonderful. I just find it so fascinating placing Nakamura in this international context. So thank you so much. That was wonderful. And Bryce.
Okay. Louise and John have been so comprehensive in talking about. Louise talked about Kazuo Nakamura's, the importance of his Japanese-Canadian background and his involvement in Japanese-Canadian community. And John's talk was rapid and very complete. So I'm just trying to figure out how I'm going to fit in here. Louise talked about Kaz's cohorts in Painters 11 being very free-spirited, and really Kaz in that company was kind of an anomaly, I think. And when I looked at, when John showed the picture of him reading a Scientific American, I could just imagine William Ronald sitting there with a Playboy or something, But he really was an interesting guy in his reserve, I suppose, his social, almost inhibition, I think. I first met him in 1976. How should I get rid of that? Should I, the buzz? Should I just speak better?
No problem. Just try and raise that just a touch.
Yeah, I met Kaz in 1976, I think it was, because 1977 was the Japanese-Canadian centennial year. And the community decided to organize a Japanese-Canadian centennial art exhibition. And I'm from Hamilton. I've always been from Hamilton. I didn't know any of the artists in Toronto, but somehow I got corralled into becoming the chair of this exhibition committee. So I came to Toronto for the first meeting, and it was the first time I met Kaz was there, Akira Yoshikawa, Heather Midori Yamada, David Fujino, And those are the people I remember off the top of my head. And, but Kaz was there, and everybody knew him. He was only, I don't know, how old was he in 1977? 40, 30s. He was born in 26, so he was 50. But he was still very well known to all of us. I just never had met him before. And I remember the way the exhibition developed. We decided that Kaz, Gus Wiseman, who was an instructor at OCA, and Joan Murray would be the adjudicators, the jury for the exhibition. And I also remember that Kaz and Gus Wiseman rejected my wonderful painting, figurative painting, and Joan Murray was the only one. She came up to me afterwards and said, I don't know why they rejected it. I really think it's fabulous. So I have this fondness in my heart for Joan Murray after all these years. And I think that the fact that Kaz participated in that project with all of us youngsters, it just sort of attests to what, reinforces what Louise was saying about how supportive he was of younger Japanese Canadians in our community. And he didn't have to do that. And he was sort of socially withdrawn, so it wasn't in his nature to proactively get involved in the community, but he did. And his brother Mikio, his older brother Mikio, was really involved with the beginning of the Japanese Canadian Cultural Center in Toronto and recruited Kaz. I know Kaz was on various committees there throughout the early years. The next time I was in contact with Kaz was when, at the Japanese Canadian Cultural Center, when they decided to relocate from the original old building. I don't know if you know that one on Winford Drive that Raymond Moriyama designed. It's one of Raymond Moriyama's first important projects. But the community outgrew that, and towards the end of the 1990s, moved into this renovated industrial kind of building that was further up on Winford Drive. And Aiko Suzuki, who another person you referred to, and you were on that committee too, that started the art gallery at the Gendai Gallery at the new Japanese Canadian Cultural Center. Bunri and Michiko Nakamura were on that committee, as well as Walter Sunohara, I think. But when they opened that space, and I give Louise and that committee a lot of credit because they lobbied to have an art gallery within that new cultural center space. And I don't think any other ethnic organization has a space like that in their cultural center. But in any case, one of the first shows that they decided to do was an exhibition of Kaz Nakamura's work. And they asked me to curate it. So, and my expertise is certainly not within Kaz's, the work that he was doing at the time, which was all these mathematical construction paintings. And he wasn't really doing that much painting, I don't think. He was doing a lot of calculations. But we decided that we would focus on these early paintings of Kaz's that he did when he was about 14 or 15 in Tashmi internment camp. And that's how I got to meet him and get to know him and Lillian, his wife, a lot better because I had to go over to the house and spend a lot of time with him. The other thing was, it was just probably at the beginning of that period where he had contracted ALS, and so that was starting to affect his condition, his physical condition a lot. And the show at the Japanese Canadian Cultural Center of his early work opened in 2001, I think. And then shortly after that, there was a show here. Was that his first retrospective here?
No, that was his second one here.
Oh, okay. So they had a retrospective here, but it's notable to say that all during that time, he had been promised an exhibition at the AGO, and he was really, really looking forward to that as a major landmark in his career. And they postponed it. And I know that the arts committee at one of the arts committees that I was involved in lobbied Dennis Reed at the AGO to try and schedule it sooner because we knew that Kaz wasn't going to be around much longer. But that never happened, and Kaz never got to see that exhibition, which is something that we really regret. Where should I go? Okay. This past year, I had the opportunity to do an exhibition at the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria, and it was in conjunction with the Japanese Canadian community out there, because also, actually, it coincided with the opening of this show coincided with a national Japanese Canadian Artists Symposium, which also took place in Victoria. So all that happened on the same weekend, and it was really fortuitous because there were a lot of young Japanese Canadian artists who are the next generation to Louise and me. We're Sansei, which is this third generation, and the Yonsei, which is the fourth generation. They're all, because of the huge intermarriage rate of our generation, most of the Yonsei generation are all half. And we never thought that they would ever be involved or be interested in their Japanese Canadian heritage at all. It was a real concern about the future of the community. But what's happened in the last maybe 5 to 10 years is that a lot of these Yonsei have started to become really interested in their Japanese background and their heritage, and their identities, right? I mean, they're sort of conflicted, especially artists who will think about those things. So we had this national symposium. There were over 100 Japanese Canadian artists there, older artists like us, and a lot of those younger artists. And it just seemed to spark a feeling of community in them. And they've reconnected or made connections and collaborated on things. It really augurs well for the Japanese Canadian community and Japanese Canadian art. But anyway, back to this show. So I had this opportunity to do a Japanese Canadian exhibition. So I thought that I would like to recognize the pioneer second generation artists, which are called the Nisei artists. Nisei is second generation. And there are a number of really prominent Nisei artists. Not only Kaz is probably one of the foremost, but also people like Roy Kyoka and Takeo Tanabe. And those three, Roy Kyoka, Tanabe, and Nakamura, it's just a coincidence that they were all born in the same year. They were all born in 1926. And I've often referred to them as the triumvirate of Japanese Canadian artists because they're all so well known and they're all so prominent. So I wanted to focus on those three, and also I included Shizue Takashima, who was born in 1928, and she was a well-known artist. She wrote a really well-known children's book called A Child in Prison Camp about her internment experience, and that's been published all around the world. But anyway, she was in the show as well, and I was particularly aiming that exhibition at the Yonsei generation because most of them had never even heard of Kazuo Nakamura or Roy Kyoka or Takeo Tanabe or Takashima. And I thought, here was a great opportunity, and the symposium just made it all possible because we had a big gala kind of event at the gallery, and all those younger Japanese Canadians were introduced to his work. So anyway, here, yeah, maybe I should go through the slides. So this one, I mean, it was not a big room, and I really, I'm grateful to Christopher Cutts because I had a lot of trouble trying to find Kazuo Nakamura's works out on the West Coast. The budget wasn't great for that show, so it was really, I really relied on Chris Cutts to round up some works of Kazuo Nakamura's that we could send out there. And one of the really, it's shameful that that a gallery like the Art Gallery of Greater Vancouver and the Vancouver Art Gallery too, they don't have any of Kazuo Nakamura's works in their collection, except for, I think, the same small etching or something. So I think I mentioned this to Christopher Cutts, and I think he's thinking of possibly introducing some of Kazuo's works to them. You would think they would know. Yeah, you really think, yeah. Yeah, that's right. That's right. But there were no works. So most of those works, this is Kazuo Nakamura's wall, and most of those works were gathered together courtesy of Chris Cutts. Okay, can we go through them? I don't know if you can see this. This is one of the early watercolors that Kaz did when he was in internment camp, and it's dark, and but you can see the mountains and the rows of internment huts in the foreground there. Next. And this is one of his, this is actually, this is one of his more well-known green-blue landscapes. But this particular one I borrowed from my uncle and aunt because at one point, Kaz said at one point that these were his bread and butter works, these things that were really popular and sold. But he also gave them to relatives for wedding presents. So I think that's how my uncle and aunt got this. Next, this is one of his string paintings. We can just go through these because John showed a bunch of these as well. And this is one of the number paintings. Yeah. Is that it? Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
thank you so much. So I have a few questions that we can get kind of started on, and you guys can just kind of talk in general. I think that I'll start off just because you guys have already kind of touched on it briefly. This question's directed at Louise and Bryce. So you guys are both artists, visual artists. What influence has Kazuo Nakamura's work had on your own artistic practice?
I don't know if his work had an influence, but just Kaz as a person.
Right.
And his, well, to be an artist, you have to have a lot of stamina. And to see somebody who, you know, has weathered all the years of doing art makes it seem possible. I suppose that, for me, that's a really important thing too, just to see other people in the field that you want to be in.
Yeah, especially for our generation, I think, Louise, because our generation was so assimilated and so quickly that even if we had some inclinations towards doing art, there was a lot of pressure to, you know, to do something else. And in fact, there are sensei who I know that have fine arts degrees, but became lawyers and accountants and engineers. You know, I mean, that's probably the case with other communities as well, but I think particularly so for us. So I really admire and treasure like other sensei artists of my generation, because I know it's really difficult. And yeah, and as Louise said, Kaz was wasn't really a role model, because I don't think too many of us were like him, so, but he was exemplary, right?
So John, the next one I have is for you. Just you did an incredible amount of research on Nakamura, and you had the opportunity to go through his personal papers, which must have been incredible. I was hoping that you could share one of like the most exciting or surprising discoveries that you made when you were going through his personal papers.
Yeah, there was my most surprising one was a Toronto Blue Jay banner that he had from, I think it was from the Toronto Star. So, and then that was just, I was looking through all these art reproductions, and all of a sudden there's this Blue Jays, Go Blue Jays, from I think the '92 when they won the World Series. So that was a bit of a surprise. The other thing was that he had a ticket stub from Charles Dickens' Curiosity Shop. And I thought that was kind of unusual. I mean, there were little bits and pieces. I think like most of our sort of collection of stubs and that were there that sort of threw me a bit in terms of, okay, well, what's this doing here? I think the other thing well, it didn't necessarily surprise me, but I was really happy about it. He did continue to follow the P11, the Painters 11s, and their career. And so you found occasional clippings of material from exhibitions from Mead in town and Hodgson. So that was, I mean, he was a very loyal person in that way, which was really interesting to see. And so even though he might not have been seeing them in person, he was still interested in what they were doing. And I think that pays homage to the fact of how valuable he felt that they were for him. The other thing that fascinated me was the Joan Murray interviews that are in this collection, where Joan Murray was a phenomenal interviewer. I was just going through her Doris McCarthy interview, and she could pull out material from people that you just would not expect. And so, well, with Kaz, oddly enough, she's the one that pulled out the one possible Japanese influence from him, because he wasn't inclined, and really his work is not necessarily, there may have been a sort of affinity to it, but not a direct influence per se, other than the fact that he collected, his first introduction to art was his uncle's collection of art magazines, which were predominantly Japanese art magazines. So she's the one that got from him saying, yeah, I think the only thing would be the sort of my monochromatic, my single color. And that was the only time I ever saw him mentioning anything on that side of things. So, and it's just an interesting conversation, because I think she got him to just relax and just discuss the work, whereas he did tend, from some other interviews, to be relatively shy about talking about his work generally. And I think Joan was always one that could somehow, people would trust and felt at ease with her in that sense. So.
Although when I was reviewing those interviews, I counted in that 1979 one where he said, I don't recall. I don't recall. He was very forthcoming, and he wouldn't kind of just fill space with talking, right? So he wasn't super forthcoming, and like you said, she did a really good job in getting answers out of him. But that kind of leads into my next question, which is, as something that you mentioned in your ACI publication, and something that when I was doing research I discovered as well, is that just how not really forthcoming he was about, his influences, talking about work and his life. And also, he didn't do a lot of writing about his work, right? Some, but not very much. So I was just wondering if you guys think that the lack of writing about his work impacted the amount of study and exposure that his work received.
The lack of his writing?
Yeah, like not having it directly from the artists. Yeah, do you think that?
I'm just wondering if that's more of a contemporary thing.
Right.
Because we tell our students to write a lot, and it seems like the people who do write a lot do get a lot more notice. I always mention to my students the reason why Jesse James, the famous outlaw, is because he would write a press release, basically, and once he held up the train, he'd give it to the conductor and it said, Jesse James robbed this train at 12:45 or whatever. So I give that as an example, but yeah. I'm just wondering, I don't know about other artists and how much they wrote, but.
Well, John speculated, I think, that that's one of the benefits that Kaz derived from being involved with Painters 11, because those guys were so outgoing. They were extroverts, and Kaz was not.
Yeah, and the odd thing is, I find it, and this is probably just the historian in me, if there's too much writing, I forget about the art. Whereas with Kaz, you really had to take a look at the work and really sort of study it. And you just had these little pearls of comments from him. But if there had been too much, I think it would have taken. And it's really hard to speak about, some of the work and what it's conveying, because it's. I mean, if it, I know it's sort of a cliche, but if it could be put in words, then why paint it? Why sculpt it? Right? It has its unique language. It has its unique way of communicating, and I think the work can stand very well on its own, even, as frustrating as it might be that there's a lack, because, I come out of the modernist tradition, so, Vasily Kandinsky and Pete Mondrian, who have volumes and volumes of writing material, but I think when you have to say that much about it, that it takes away from just the sheer sensuality and the power of the work itself, so. But I also think, he knew writing wasn't his strength. that wasn't his best way of communicating. And whereas with this level of ease and comfort and ability to speak so simply, I mean, it's just, there's an ease with the work that's just amazing to look at and to sense that there's a level of confidence there that you don't see very often in artists. You only see in some of the really good artists, and that's definitely a quality that's here. I mean, I can't even, some of the works I can't even imagine how I would have done it differently, and that's usually the success of it that got that piece just right.
I think I would be disappointed. As we're very stoic, and so I don't know. I think, so I like the fact that he didn't write a lot about his work, even though we tell students to write a lot about their work. But I guess it depends on the type of work that you do.
So I think you can't have a talk about Nakamura without touching on his number structure series. And he considered those to be his most important series, and they're really emblematic of his interest in science and patterns that were central themes to his work throughout his whole entire career. So I was just wondering if we could touch on the kind of critical reception of Nakamura's number structure works within his lifetime, and also versus kind of now how people talk about them.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, someone who could speak to that is Christopher Cutts, because he was in the middle of those works being made. But I think they were meant to be a very personal examination. They're based on series, they're progressions, whether it's a Pascal triangle or a Fibonacci series, and they're a curious work to look at. I mean, there's a beautiful, and I talk about this in the book, this element of the mathematical, the numerical versus the hand, the human hand. And I think there's almost a sort of poetic connection between the sort of abstractness of the numbers and the fact that he spent the time to write all of these out by hand. I mean, there was almost a sort of meditative process for it, a way of sort of communicating with the universe that really could only be personal in a sense. And I think that's why it didn't necessarily exhibit that many works. When he did do large canvases, or even these, but like the ones at the AGO in the National Gallery, these huge pieces, they were in his trademark bluish-green color. So there is still that connection back to the work, and I think all of his work is examining in some way a sort of underlying fundamental structure of the universe, our approach or our understanding of it, and that the numbers were sort of the next logical step that he was going to go into that. And as you know, the only video we have of him is him explaining these numerical progressions to what I believe is an art audience. Who probably were wondering, what is he doing here? But I think he wanted to convey the enthusiasm of these. If you know anything about some of these numerical sequences, like the Fibonacci one is famous as 13th century monk, and it's the rate of progression of the growth of a seashell, the reproduction rate of rabbits, etc. It's like a very fundamental, nature-based progression. And so examining that and working through that was for him a way of sort of getting closer to that. But I like that idea of the hand, of writing these out by hand and not trying to stencil them as if they were looking like serif numbers, but rather very much handwritten sort of numbers. But I think they were very much of a personal exercise. Yeah, go for it.
Not only did he write them out, as you saw, and then of course when the numbers got big, they become more abstract because they were so small, But these ones, he carefully painted around and left the negative space out. So that one is the right space. He didn't scratch those out. And even the grid is carefully painted, even every little square there, he's left that little negative space in between. So they were intensely laborious, kind of nuts. And the idea between the numbers was to mimic the patterns that we see everywhere in nature. And that's where the Fibonacci number comes up over again. And there's certain order that we see in sort of chaos, there's perfect order, and he found it in the numbers. And as far as the writing, That's his writing there. So you got to be able to decipher his numbers, and it ain't that hard. It really is just through serial summation. I sat with him many hours, and I would glaze over, and then I'd come back the next week, and he'd tell me the same thing, and a few things stuck, but not much. But anyway, I'm glad to pull up the blue one, because when you think about that, that's nutty what he did. And he only made a few paintings, and primarily they were made for a show we had at Ron Moore's gallery in '84. So most of the paintings are dated from that area. Otherwise, there's just piles and piles of calculations, graph papers. And he really thought this was it. I'm coming up with the grand unifying theorem of all and everything in the world. That's how aspirational he was. He was going for the big one. Sorry. Yeah.
No, Chris, no, I mean, like I said, you have pretty intimate knowledge of these things.
Well, just to be clear, so he painted around all those numbers?
Yes. They're not scratched out.
Or they're not painted?
They're not painted on either. But go take a look at the painting when you go. That painting's here.
Where was he living at this time?
He's in Toronto.
Now, you were talking about the critical reception. He didn't care about the critical reception, right? I mean, this was really a personal exercise for him, a personal sort of communication rather than worrying about exhibiting these works.
I do think that he was so happy when the National Gallery purchased some, though, right? Like that was a big moment in that video, and he makes sure that he mentions that, right? Where he gets questioned about how this sequence, like, why do you make it into paintings? And then he shared, you know, that the National Gallery purchased one, that the Art Gallery of Windsor put it on their annual newsletter, and so there is a sense of deep pride that they were getting recognized beyond just, you know.
Yeah, no, good point.
Yeah, he was explaining it to me, but I didn't understand it, and my eyes kind of glazed over too, but okay, yes.
Yeah.
And then everybody I've met said they'd never understood what the numbers were about, but he was so intense when he talked about the numbers that you could tell it was really important to him. And so if he got critical, if people were critical about the numbers, I don't think he would care. He was just so focused on that, which is what I guess every artist should be, you know, just to continue with what your passion is.
But they're aesthetically so beautiful. You know, they reminded me at one point of those cascading numbers and formulas in that film, A Beautiful Mind. No, A Beautiful Mind.
Oh, right, yeah, sorry.
And so there's that beautiful score, for one thing, the musical score, but then all these numbers sort of cascading down. And anyway, just a thought.
So I'd like to touch on the issues of identity and belonging that you discuss in your publication, John, regarding Nakamura's work, in particular around his suspension series. So in what ways do you think his lived experiences played a role in kind of his search for meaning and belonging?
You asking me specifically?
Well,
yeah.
Sorry. I don't know.
From what I saw, I mean, obviously I'm not Japanese Canadian, but with him, there was, and I think there's the Tora interview, not Tora, that's the movie, but Tora interview from 1972, which was quite interesting because in that he was quite happy with the notion of assimilation.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, and mixing, and I think that's part of his sort of universalism, and I think that's significant in this wanting to belong, and not having been, you know, chastised, isolated because he was Japanese Canadian in the Second World War with the internment camp, and I think that really did frustrate him. And the fact that you couldn't go back to British Columbia, couldn't go back to where you grew up in Vancouver, must have been incredibly alienating in the sense of just being totally rejected in that sense. And I think he certainly carried that with him. And that was one of the fascinating things I found, was this drawing of the Tashmi camp, which seemed to be mid-'80s, but was probably done during a reunion, but that he could remember it so vividly, and that it was still imprinted on him. And I think that moment of being isolated and essentially kicked out was one where he didn't want to see that happen again, and really pushed for this sense of, I got to belong to the larger whole type of thing. But again, I mean, I don't necessarily have that experience as much as obviously your personal experience.
Yeah, there's that whole, the effect of intergenerational trauma that's so much discussed these days. But you never really sense that in people like Kazuo Nakamura or the work of Kazuo Nakamura or Roy Kyoka or Takeo Tanabe. You know, they because their aspirations were a lot different. I mean, they wanted to really make it as Canadian international artists. So. Yeah, it's interesting when you start thinking about all this stuff.
Your use of the word alienation is interesting too, because those paintings, the green and blue paintings of forests and things, I guess are recollecting British Columbia, so it's a memory, but it's also recollecting, I suppose, Tashmi, where he was interned. So when he was painting, I guess maybe he was not coming to terms with the alienation there, but kind of curious, and maybe when you said alienation, yeah, those paintings do have this feeling of alienation and not quite being there, or not quite, not a fear of that place or anything, but just there's a sense of that in those works.
And the thing that always fascinated me with the works is there are no people.
Yes.
You know, there are a few in the early works, but after that they simply, and I think there's maybe a couple of the landscapes where there's a single isolated figure, like that exists in the work, and there's a real sense of loneliness tied into just having that single isolated figure in this massive sea of blue, in a sense, and that always, in a way, wanting to belong, but at the same time feeling somewhat isolated. And you're right about the BC landscape. All of his landscapes all have the high horizon, which you would have had with the Rockies. You know, the high horizon, and he never abandoned that. You rarely see a low horizon line in any of the landscape works, because the BC landscape just was so ingrained in him.
Not having people in the paintings, I can kind of relate to that, because I remember in art school you had to do figurative drawing. And you know, drawing these white bodies, and how would this work in my own artwork? It would just seem too awkward and too weird. And you could go and say, well, that might be an influence from a lot of Asian or Japanese works where there isn't the figure much, but in the images, but still, I think there would, you know, I see a lot of awareness of boundaries too in Kazu's work. So,
and sometimes there is that pragmatic thing that maybe he just wasn't good at the figure, because I mean, most of his art education was in commercial art. I mean, in Vancouver, it was a technical commercial design school where he met McDonald. And then when he went to Central Tech, it was joining their commercial art program that he started out for. And I'm discovering and sorry, no disparagement with Doris McCarthy, but she was terrible at the figure. and in fact was criticized when she was in England at one of the schools that she was studying in England, and was told by Duncan Grant that, yeah, your figures aren't that great.
And abstraction works perfectly with the landscape,
It
whereas the figure, maybe doesn't.
So sometimes it's just not your thing, in a way. But it's funny that, like, this work is you do have that one moment of an isolated figure popping up, and I always...
And for those who can't see, there's a boat right on the horizon line. You can kind of see the shadow just if you are having a hard time making out the figure. Yeah. Well, I believe we are out of time of my questions, but you know what? It's best to hear from the questions from the audience anyway. So is there any questions that you want to ask the panelists? Yes?
That last blue one that we saw, was that mowed down trees in the foreground and then water in the middle ground and grown trees in the background? It's in the front here, those
So,
chopped down trees, tree trunks,
oh, that's interesting. I've never seen it that way before.
harvested lumber? Or is it all water?
I believe it's a body of water,
It's
but
all water,
perhaps I'm going to speak to that.
But he does have reflections in the work, so that might be a possibility on the lower part, yeah. That would be interesting.
Any other questions? Yes?
In the slideshow, there are two sculptures, the one from
Yes.
the airport and the other one that you called Lost, which and both of those seem very sad. Is that common for things to be either locked up or just disappear?
Well, he didn't, I think there's only a couple of exhibitions that I saw that he actually exhibited the sculpture. The Pearson Airport one, the smaller pieces were not ones, and the dates on them are all usually just about circa 1950. So they weren't widely exhibited, and I'm not sure why he did that. But Chris, do you know, because you had a number of the small sculptures, do you know, because I had only seen a couple of exhibitions of them, and that was pretty much it.
Bunch of years ago with the drawings.
Mhm.
And stuff like that. Yeah.
Because they're just not firmly dated. They're most of them in the 1950s for a lot.
Sat around the fireplace, didn't they? I remember them going to that. They were all around the fireplace. And then you guys dug a big one. Oh, you got a big one now. A fairly big about that. Yeah.
So they weren't necessarily for public consumption then.
It's funny. They were there, and then there was a couple of cement ones out in the front patio. Am I remembering that correctly? Yeah.
Wasn't it at purpose? There was a...
Yes, yeah, that's good, too, right? Yeah, because some of them have a label on the bottom. They show them.
So yeah, sorry I can't say more than that. I am disappointed the Pearson Airport one isn't up right now. So even though on their website they say it's between Terminal 3, I think 65 and 67, but I went there and they're not there. And the last communication I had was, well, if they're not there, they're in storage. So.
Apparently when they built the new terminal, they couldn't get it back in.
Oh, okay.
That's
Cool.
why it's in storage.
Because yeah, they're
They
beautiful.
actually built it there in the airport.
Yeah, they're beautiful pieces, so it'd be really nice to see them again, and there's so much iconography with it, because it's not only galaxies, but it recalls the Wright brothers' first plane in terms of its appearance, and then there's a whole set, you have a whole set of his drawings that he did for those sculptures, which are just fascinating. Yeah. They may, yeah, I don't think they know, because the person I was talking to, that was essentially just, yeah, they're not there, they're in storage, so.
Any other questions?
Does anybody know if Kaz ever went to Japan?
That's a very good question.
Because I don't.
In his papers, he's got a leaflet from the 1970 Japan Expo. So, and he does have a few from a Kyoto museum as well, so but otherwise I didn't get much. Yeah, that's the thing. I don't think he ever went. I think this was given to him. So that was probably it then, because, yeah, there is a number of small papers that you have that indicate that he went there, but I couldn't get confirmation on it.
Any other questions from the audience? Or final thoughts anybody want to share? There's so much we didn't get a chance to cover, but so when we break for refreshments, there's some refreshments in the lobby, and I hope you get a chance to see the exhibition. If there was anything that didn't get touched on, or you have questions or want further information on, you can find any of us during the reception in the lobby. But I want to, yeah, go ahead.
I will advertise, if you ever a chance, go to the Art Canada Institute website. You just do search words Art Canada Institute. They've been doing a phenomenal job of producing volumes on Canadian artists. The monograph series is just phenomenal. They've done about half of the Painters 11. And they're free for download for PDF. They have teaching tools that they've developed as well for them. Some of them have been printed, although I think they paused it simply because of COVID, and also they're in a tricky situation, and I know Jane's not crazy about the fact that we don't have a Nakamura hardcover yet, and whether we'll have one, but they're a not-for-profit, so it's very difficult to get these things published, very tricky to get them published and to figure out what price to offer them and then make sure you're recouping the cost for the publishing house, as well as not making a profit. And they've been trying to work with that with the University of Toronto, why there has been some hard copies out, but not a whole bunch of them, simply because it threatens their non-profit status, which has been the big problem. But they're all available for free, and they've been hiring scholars to write these texts, which has really been great. And they are beautiful volumes, and you have massive amount of reproductions. And because the other project of the Art Canada Institute, not that I'm on their board or anything, but just because I'm one of their authors, was to make as available as possible as many reproductions. So each volume has over 80 works reproduced in them, which is just amazing because, as probably some of you know, what you see in a museum, McLaughlin's not bad. It circulates its collection pretty well, but the National Gallery or the AGO, you're seeing 5% of what they have. And so there's a lot of works in vaults that you just don't get to see. So the Art Canada Institute's project was A, to get the Canadian artists known, and B, is to get as many works reproduced as possible of those Canadian artists. So it's really worthwhile checking it out. And
Josh's publication on Kazuo Nakamura is excellent, and it's, like he said, free and available on his website, and I encourage everybody to check it out. I just want to say thank you so much each to the panelists. Thank you so much for coming today. It was so great to hear and have a really wonderful conversation about Nakamura. And if you guys don't mind sticking around so that if any other further questions come, that would be great. And thank you so much, everyone.